Good evening, and thank you for joining us again in DiEM25. My name is Renata, Ávila, and now tonight I have the pleasure to exchange ideas in an interview with the most famous tech critic and probably one of the much needed voices of reason at this time, Evgeny Morozov. We passed the day number 100 on this emergency of COVID, and that has shifted tremendously all the discourse that we had the 2 years before. 2 years before, we had a very critical, very skeptical vision about technology, and in a matter of 100 days, it seems that all the conversation had radically shifted. So thank you, Evgeny, so much for your time, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are really keen on hearing your ideas. You have audience here listening from Brazil, from Lebanon, from most of the countries of Europe, and we are very looking forward on your general overview of the situation and the role of technology and the role that technology is playing into this. And also, we will like to later address some specific questions that our membership had asked. Welcome tonight.
Sure. Well, hi, Renata, and welcome and hello to everyone who has joined this live stream. It's a pleasure for me to join. I'm in Rome. I've been here, I wouldn't say in the epicenter, but quite close to it, in Italy for the past 5 weeks now, I guess. And in that time, I've had some time to reflect, I guess, upon some of the structural changes we are seeing in global capitalism, but also in the way in which technology firms have played their game in the past few weeks, which of course has been an instructive experience for all of us, not particularly surprising, I would say, to me, but nonetheless worth reflecting upon. I've also kept myself busy here putting together a daily reading list about the politics of COVID-19 and the various national and international responses to it. So that's what kept me busy and away from writing, which I probably should have done more of, but I finally managed to put my thoughts together. So there are a couple of articles that came out, and there is a big article coming out next week where I will articulate some of the thoughts I will also share with you tonight. Let me warn you at the beginning that I'm probably a bit less sanguine about this crisis signifying the end of capitalism or the onset of a new era driven by solidarity and whatnot. I clearly think that less sanguine than many other thinkers on the left, let's put it that way, who I think have taken a rather optimistic, if not to say naive, reading of the predicament. And I'll try to lay out my case as to why we should be quite cautious in our optimism, but I would also like to maybe bring a little bit more complexity to the ongoing discussions about what all of that means for democracy and what all of that means also for progressive movements who are trying to also chart their own path in this new environment. Let me again warn you at the beginning that I'm not very keen of this quite cliche framing that has been circulating in the media for the past few weeks of this being the onset of techno-totalitarianism of some kind, that, you know, we are entering the future that Orwell has predicted and that all of us will have our privacy destroyed. And I think, of course, there are quite a lot of tectonic shifts happening in terms of how much data about us is collected and will be collected. I think this way of thinking about democracy, but also the more progressive democratic future, I think it inherently falls into these cliches and kind of modes and ways of thinking that we inherited from the Cold War. So if anything, I hope that by the end of our conversation tonight, I will have convinced some of the listeners and viewers that there are more complex and different ways to think about what this privatization of politics by means of technology means for democracy. And it's possible that in the long term, the effects of this privatization of politics and the effects of delegating more and more power and ability to shape the future and more importantly, to disable other alternative futures, which might be possible as information technology. So the effects of kind of putting all these things into the basket of big tech, I think they probably far outweigh the effects it has on privacy and our individual autonomy, as important as those values are. Maybe I'll just say a couple of more words at the beginning so that we have something to work with, and then we can have a more free conversation. So, the reason why I guess I'm a bit less sanguine than the other thinkers about this being the end of capitalism, it's quite simple, because while I agree that clearly neoliberalism as a regime, which has traditionally advocated austerity, public cuts to public budgets, privatization, and whatnot, while that ideology is now morally and intellectually bankrupt, capitalism as such does not survive and advance only through neoliberalism. In the article, which I'm going to publish next week in The Guardian, the argument I'm making is that essentially neoliberalism is the bad cop of contemporary capitalism. But there is also the good cop. And the good cop is the ideology that in my own work throughout the years, I've been calling solutionism. Right? And it's this idea that all the problems that are created by this neoliberal expansion, right? So as neoliberalism goes about preaching entrepreneurship and innovation around the globe, it does cause a lot of havoc. So as that happens, there is this nicer cop, the good cop, so to say, which essentially preaches universal band-aid, which offers solutions that sound quite cosmopolitan and humanitarian to essentially clean up the mess left by neoliberalism, and to do that nicely, cleanly, slickly, and also at a hefty profit. And the existence of that kind of better, good, well-intentioned cop that we all have come to love or enjoy or hate, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum, the existence and the activities of this solutionist project are only going to expand and get amplified significantly than what we are seeing. And we can, of course, draw distinctions between different strands in the solutionist thought. And I've done some of that in the past, and I'll do some of that in the future. But ultimately, it all boils down to the fact that regardless of how privacy secure and privacy aware many of these new technologies that will be rolled out also by this new alliance with Google and Apple will be, I think we have to take a longer historical view of what's currently going on. And while there might even be some positive effects for privacy, autonomy, and individual rights, we also have to understand that the increased mediation of public life and of the political activities by a set of private firms, even though they might clothe themselves in the language of technical standards or in the language of protocols, that increased privatization of private democratic life, it is quite dangerous, because ultimately, and this one key point which I will make, and then we can go into the conversation mode, it's important to understand that neoliberalism as such, it has a blueprint which it seeks to implement. So in the case of neoliberalism, we know what that blueprint is, right? It's to essentially prevent spontaneous social coordination among people from taking place, because that function of coordination in society is to be played by the market, right? So instead of having kind of solidarity-based economy of some kind where people can coordinate or plan, we would like entrepreneurs commodifying and selling things, right? So the blueprint of neoliberalism is quite clear, and we know what to expect. But I think we also have to understand that the goal of this sibling of the neoliberal project of solutionism, it's quite distinct. And the goal of solutionism is something else entirely. And it's not to promote blueprints, but to disable blueprints of others. And this is where I think it's very important to understand that essentially where neoliberalism privatizes to some extent our infrastructures, and it privatizes our technologies, solutionism privatizes politics, right? So when neoliberalism controls and shrinks our budgets, solutionism actually shrinks our imaginations and shrinks the space available for kind of some alternative action plans, right? And my fear is that if we examine and look back into this crisis 5, 10, 15 years from now, what we're going to see is that this is really a defining moment when the public has surrendered its capacity to engage in this acts of collective world making and collective imagination, if you will, in order to develop a non-neoliberal paradigm of some kind, and almost a complete surrender to the neoliberal project under the disguise of this solutionist friends that are now tempting us with their offers from Silicon Valley. So again, it's not a very usual reading of the situation, and in part because so much of our debate now is still dominated by the frameworks that I think we have inherited from the past, where we would like to imagine a big brother watching us, and we would like to imagine that there is manipulation of our mind by and of course now we will add fake news, governments, all of that. Those are real problems. But I think it's important that we also reflect upon the longer term effects of what it means for collective action, what it means for our collective social imaginary, if you will. How can we imagine alternative worlds, and whether we can imagine alternative worlds where the services of Amazon, the services of Palantir, the services of Google and Apple have become almost inalienable parts. They've become the default background condition of public life as such, right? And we have seen that in action. So as things got really bad in the United Kingdom, we immediately saw Boris Johnson calling upon the tech industry to step forward and play this proactive role. And if that's really the case, then this industry is its reach and its influence goes far beyond what we used to think about Wall Street, that it was too big to fail. I mean, here, the failure of the tech industry, if they manage to establish themselves as this kind of gatekeepers of public life and also of, fundamental dimensions of it, like healthcare and education, it would mean that they are not just too big to fail, they are basically impossible. It's impossible to imagine a world without them, right? And that's, I think, a point where we are, and that's why I think we have to think a little bit deeper and harder about what this really means for a democratic future.
So sorry to stop you here, but I think there is a very important point, especially because of the kind of people watching this now, on this defining moment, on this risking, or maybe we are too late on the privatization of politics. And what I wanted to ask you is the role of the state, because we have seen the state, at least very strong states in most of the cases, failing epically in this last 100 days, completely out of control, completely unable to even have access to key data. And we have seen the companies stepping in. On the one hand, you have some people saying that now everybody will realize the importance of the state, and the state will be, and state intervention and state action will become more important than ever. And then on the other hand, the point that you were making, most of the key infrastructure that we need to continue our lives is mediated by tech companies concentrated in basically 2 countries. So I wanted you to go deeper on that, on the role of the state, and if the state is so dependent on the big technology companies concentrated in such few jurisdictions, how can we? I mean, how can we even think of a different future?
Sure. Well, I tend to take a very historical reading of this kind of incapacity of the state. Again, it's not some kind of essential feature of public bureaucracies that they have to be inefficient. For the most part, where they are inefficient and where they are malfunctioning and where they are just corrupt entities, it's usually a consequence of many historical factors. By and large, in the last few decades, I would argue that those factors are indeed connected to the neoliberal agenda and to a reconfiguration of the state where it did exist to function more like a company and more like a firm. So, trying to imagine that bureaucrats were actually entrepreneurs. So they were kind of they were engaged in rent seeking as, corporations would. And in places where it did not exist, like in much of the global South, again, for historical reasons tied to colonialism and tied to imperialism and whatnot, the agenda, of course, was always trying to somehow bypass the emergence of an autonomous and sovereign state entity and replacing it with some kind of an almost quasi-algorithmic entity that would just be responding to external incentives provided by the World Bank and the IMF. So in conditions like that, where there was very little opportunity and space for the state to become actually a well-functioning entity that has been geared to work in the interest of the public and in the interest of people who actually elected it, it's of course not a particular surprise at this time that the state is not functioning and is unable to deal with this challenge. And this is where I think we immediately get into this kind of second order discussion where, on the one hand, this is where this kind of good cop of solutionism and bad cop of neoliberalism would split, and they would pretend that they are not part of the same entity and they're not part of the same story, and the solutionists would come onto the stage and say, oh, but only if you run your infrastructure from Amazon Web Services, or only if you put AI in your every single public agency, or if you hire the services of volunteer, you can turn your country into Denmark. You can turn your country into Sweden or whatever, and you will have a very well-functioning bureaucratic system that will do everything. You just need to essentially buy this efficient bureaucratic system as a service. And I also understand the concerns, which here we are in a very interesting dialectic, because on the one hand, part of the community that probably you and I belong to have fears about an omnipotent state that is capable of monitoring communication, surveying everything, and essentially taking full advantage of modern communications in order to constrain the liberties of people. But another part of our community is concerned about a completely incompetent state that would just not be able to even manage the infrastructures it might need to run in order to do contact tracing, for example, when it comes to fighting COVID. And in that case, the solutionist temptation is even greater, because clearly you would rather have Apple or Google run the show than a malfunctioning kind of decrepit state that has been paralyzed by decades of neoliberalism. So it's not a very easy position to argue from, because ultimately we are asking people to accept the need to resist the pressure of these efficient giants in Silicon Valley. And at the same time, we expect them to hope that somehow something good will come out of the state, which failed to reform itself for decades and centuries, right? And not just in in the global South, but also you can look at a country like Italy, where the state has been always a quite problematic entity. And if you were to ask a lot of people, including those who would claim to be leftists and Democrats, whether they would trust the state to do something, whether they would rather have Google do it, they will have a very complicated calculus, right? And in this sense, I just think we have to resist. And that's why I started with this more historical take on this problem. We have to resist this historical take that just presents states as some kind of bandits interested in rent seeking, and not prisoners and hostages of global capitalism and neoliberalism, essentially.
And then you have the third way, and it's very interesting how the third way of doing things is kind of squeezed between the monopoly tech companies have and the rules of that the states, the rules that neoliberalism push globally. And I want to refer to a concrete case. I know that you probably are familiar with the case of ventilators done with 3D printers, and then you have social innovation. You have community, especially here in Europe, but everywhere you have community, you have citizens active and aware that they can take part on something more meaningful than just discussing how terrible things are on social media, or just sharing some little bits of useful information. And when citizens want to activate and want to do something meaningful using technology and innovation and collaboration, it is squashed by the system. So is there any, and I'm very afraid that the same thing that happened with the makers community and these 3D printers and ventilators and all the threats of legal threats and all the, and then big companies jumping in and patenting these small innovations and locking innovation in, will repeat when we want to try to develop a public interest infrastructure from the municipalities or the state. So I wanted to hear your view on that, and how visible the obstacles to the ability of citizens to organize and do something meaningful is, how difficult it's becoming.
Yes, well, I mean, look, I think it relates to some extent to what I was saying earlier about solutionism being there to disable alternative blueprints of organizing society, right? And this is where we just have to reflect on the last 30 years or so, because ultimately, the initial neoliberal agenda of spreading markets and turning everything into commodities and to some extent preventing non-market modes and methods of social coordination, it got much easier after the Soviet Union fell apart because there was no longer a viable communist enemy. So to some extent, from early 90s onwards, it was clear that we will have some kind of neoliberalism on steroids. And this is why, Francis Fukuyama wrote what he wrote. And that's why, we got all the commentary in 1990s about globalization and digitalization going hand in hand and spreading markets and democracy around the globe. What I think has happened, though, and which is something that I think the early cheerleaders for this, like Tom Friedman, for example, for this neoliberal utopia powered by digitization did not contend with or did not think about, is that this digital technologies like artificial intelligence or like big data, even though they do not naturally somehow favor social coordination or collaboration, that despite what we hear from a lot of our friends on the left, there is nothing natural or inherent in these technologies favoring some kind of socialist or communist outcomes, not at all. But they can at least make it easier for us to imagine an alternative future where production is completely automated but also decentralized, where digital technologies are there to support fully available universal education and healthcare system, which of course is a much more appealing picture than the current dystopia of mass death that we are living through. And this is where I think the ideology of solutionism is precisely to kick in and to essentially disable the deployment of the immense radical potential of these technologies and infrastructures for the sake of social transformation that might take us away from the market economy and from the market as the essential, as the central and essential coordinating mechanism of relations in society. So, to put it in a kind of in a soundbite also almost, the whole point of solutionism is to convince us that disruption of everything on the periphery is worthwhile so that we can keep the central institution of everyday life and of modern society, which is the market, completely intact and unchangeable. So with that kind of theoretical background behind us, of course, if you look at the ways in which 3D printers and other technologies right now can be deployed to help us deal with the crisis, I mean, of course, there are tons of different ways in which it can be accelerated. You just need to examine the patent system and the way in which patenting works to realize that, right now we are clearly under innovating simply because so much knowledge is locked up, related to not just, vaccines, but also related to distribution technologies. And essentially, this is the part of the equation that I think we know well. So the deployment and the use of law and various legal mechanisms to kind of keep capitalism and markets intact and kind of functioning as they are without any radical threats from coming into the picture. But I'm much more interested in the softer ways, because ultimately solutionism, it's almost, it's kind of common sense now. So it's an ideology of common sense, which buys legitimacy to the neoliberal project, right? And I think that we have to contend with that, and we have to understand the ways in which our pragmatic and practical decisions, because this is what this ideology thrives in. It's this attitude of, ad hoc, pragmatic search for solutions. And in a crisis situations like this one, everybody wants solutions and they want them fast, and it's exactly the time conducive to the emergence and, let's put it that way, intensification and perhaps solidification of paradigms that, looking in retrospect, we would have never accepted.
And also it's a matter of rights, no? And there is a rapid erosion of rights very easily for the sake of a solution that is needed, and combined with the fear of the people, the incompetence of the state, and the chaos of the situation, many things that we will never accept are being accepted and even asked for. And here I wanted to refer, because many people wanted to hear your views on this contact tracing and all the surveillance technologies that have been deployed as with very little questioning and broad acceptance as ways to manage this COVID-19 crisis. And,
Yes.
and I will specifically, I think I will love if you can connect it with geopolitics and take a look at the situation in China, take a look at the situation here in Europe and in the rest of the world and the implications.
Yes. Well, I mean, abstracting from the ways in which it is technologically implemented, I think I personally do not have much of a problem with contact tracing. I mean, I think that done right and done correctly, and this is where, you know, we risk opening a much kind of bigger Pandora's box, so to say, because some people would argue that it's impossible to do it in a way that will fully respect people's privacy given the limitations of technology. So that's a discussion that I'm just not competent enough to have. But that aside, I think it's an idea that makes sense. I think what, and of course, you know, we have seen that it can be done in a much kind of more punitive way. And I would argue that the countries we have seen in East Asia, especially, have, for various political reasons or for various reasons that have to do with public health, they have gone for a much more punitive version of this, where it's not fully optional. You know, you have to adjust your behavior, you have to modify your behavior, you have to, you know, you're informed in a very intrusive way, and from there, right, you can then kind of go into much more I wouldn't say terrifying, but less permissive implementations, where you would join this idea of contact tracing with kind of predictive analytics of some kind that will then determine whether to allow you to enter a particular part of the city, right? Or whether to receive certain services, where, you know, you can, of course, start thinking about all sorts of permissions and entitlements that will be based on probabilistic evaluation of how likely you are to be sick, essentially, right? So that has all sorts of implications, and I think we have seen some of them realized in China. Again, looking at it more philosophically and abstractly, what interests me more is the way in which we have arrived at a situation where essentially, you know, Google and Apple have co-opted the work of some excellent European privacy researchers, and they have, you know, been quite explicit about that. That, you know, essentially, the announcement that was made on Friday reflects weeks of, if not months, of efforts by well-respected academics in Europe, in European universities. And, you know, what bothers me more is the way in which we have been unable to deputize or to encourage, right, other institutions in society to essentially act upon those ideas, right? And that, again, that brings me back to the point I keep returning to, which is that essentially once the infrastructure with which we can act, right, and with which we can act fast and powerfully, as long as that infrastructure remains under the control of just a handful of corporate players, they will probably be the ones being able to act upon it quicker than others, right? And simply by the virtue of having all those resources and having the expertise. So for me, the key lesson to learn from this is not, you know, that we have to fear Google or Apple, but rather it's how come we have not managed in democratic societies in Europe to encourage others to do something with these insights that have been present, you know, in the debate for quite some time, right? And where are those funds, and where are those encouragements, where are those schemes, you know, where are those methods of coordination in society that would enable us to build truly bottom-up implementations with the funding that's needed, with the scale that's needed, and with the robust public policy that's needed. And of course, in the times when we have abandoned even thinking about these issues because we no longer expect anything innovative to come out of actors other than technology companies, it's also a quite predictable and logical state of affairs that they would be the ones, Google and Apple, that will jump to this opportunity, also in part to whitewash their reputations, which after years of backlash stand in patterns, right? So for them, it makes perfect sense. But what I think it should make us reflect upon is just how many other non-corporate actors and players and what kind of schemes we'd like to have in our broader ecosystem, so to say, so that alternative methods and forms of social coordination between hackers, activists, citizen groups, neighbors, hospitals, universities could actually come on the service faster and with much more effort and with much more support, and not just die off as prototypes.
And the support has to come from somewhere, and the interesting thing, I mean, I'm not European, I'm Central American. My country never has money. There's never money there. And there's a big divide on knowledge. But what infuriates me, and is one of the reasons why I joined DiEM, is the inability of Europe to seize the opportunities. What you described, the group of Carmela Troncoso and others, the brilliant academics funded by the EU, most of them, come with a great option to make viable, implement a state-of-the-art technology and protect our privacy. And then big Silicon Valley companies always grab it, and they don't even give thanks in the form of paying taxes. So to me, I know that the ability of building alternatives is not, sadly, is not in my country, sadly, is not the way that the industry in China is shaping. So it's really here in Europe. So but at the same time, we have the increased mediation of all political activities of European citizens by Silicon Valley companies, from campaigns to campaigns of awareness, from everything, like from all the education of the children, all the European parents using Zoom or using Google Hangouts. It's really tragic to see how colonized Europe is in terms of the technology. So, but now we have a lot of money. I mean, there's the European Commission opened a big money stream, and those immense amount of resources maybe there is the key to reverse the situation. But how would you suggest, and what would be like a shortcut and a compelling argument that we can make to our politicians to seize this opportunity as the opportunity to reposition Europe and take back the control of key infrastructures?
Well, I mean, look, I think the task is clearly a political task, and it has to do, I think, there are concrete steps of realizing it, but I think before we get to the concrete steps, it's very important to understand what it is that we would like to argue. And this is where I think that a lot of movements also on the left, they have not entirely retired from the knockdown that they received as the communism fell apart. And this is where I think we find ourselves on the left in a very tricky situation, because we have not found the right arguments for saying why we need a different technological universe, right? We've learned to speak the language of rights. So we know how to find faults with digital infrastructures operated by Google and Facebook. So we can easily say that they're not compliant with GDPR or right to be forgotten or socioeconomic rights in general. And all of that, I think, is good. But clearly, it does not answer the more pragmatic question, which anybody with money to invest would ask you, but do these technologies pay off, right? Or do this, is there a way to basically have innovation with those technologies? And that's, of course, a debate that in a very banal way, Europe has been having for many, many years, whether GDPR is good for business or bad for business, whether there will be a new industry of firms that will flourish here. And that's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that, we have to essentially show and document, but also argue at the more abstract level, that putting people together equipped with powerful digital technologies and enabling ways of collaboration across them is not just good because it will satisfy their egos or will make them feel less alienated about contemporary society. It would, at the end of the day, also result in immense social innovation and in immense discovery of new things, new practices, and also new techniques of production. And as long as you can make that argument at the very abstract theoretical level, for me, it would address the challenge and the great theoretical challenge that neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, for example, have traditionally put to leftist, socialist governments, because their own mind, shaped by these binaries of the Cold War, conceived of only two paradigms: centrally planned economies of the Soviet Union kind, where everything is being planned by central planners and where there is very little discovery of new knowledge, or fully neoliberal economies of the Western world, of the kind of global North, where the more we deregulate, the more entrepreneurship we unleash, the more consumption we unleash, and entrepreneurs and consumers in this weird dance with each other discover new things about the world, new tastes, but also new ways to satisfy them and produce cheaper than competitors. And I think that as long as we cannot coherently articulate a paradigm that will transcend this binary and will say, okay, look, social cooperation or solidarity can be as good for collaboration, but also for production. It can be excellent for innovation. It can be excellent for harnessing the things that we uncover as we talk to each other in everyday life, as we go about our everyday activities, as we go about pursuing our most dearest of interest. All of that produces immense value. And we need to start building infrastructures that can harness that value, package it, integrate it, and make it available to the wider public. And I think that, unfortunately, with the exception of a couple of products and projects from free software or Wikipedia, which also can lend themselves to ambiguous interpretations. There is also it's very easy to come up with a Hayekian interpretation of Wikipedia, and it doesn't help that Jimmy Wales himself is a libertarian. So it's possible to do a very different reading of why it has come to do what it does. But in the absence of concrete specific projects that can show us how social coordination unleashed, and completely sort of disentangled from commercial incentives of competition can produce tangible value that can make us, buy things, produce things, buy bread and eat, at a very trivial level. I think it will be very hard to convince anybody in such institutions that you've mentioned that we need a different way of doing things. And, there will be small pockets of money and funding. There will be people eager to finance crazy people who would like to care about privacy and decentralization, and they have always been and they will always be. But we need to completely radically change the paradigm and show that not only do we potentially lose the opportunities of harnessing all this genuine knowledge that people are producing, we're also entailing huge costs, right? Because we just let Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft run the show. And unless we manage to calculate what those costs are, what kind of futures are they disabling, what kind of resources are not coming to the ground because these people control all the infrastructure, we will not be able to make that argument. And by the way, maybe we are segueing into that part of the conversation. This is also what I intend to do with the Syllabus project, right? It's essentially to show, which I will explain a little bit more, hopefully towards the end, but it's partly to show how different the internet could be and how different our perception of what information online is and how it can be consumed could be if only we actually stop seeing and viewing Google, Amazon, YouTube, and all these big players as positive contributions to the public sphere, but also start treating them as negative contributions that entail costs in terms of attention, in terms of ease of discovery of high quality content, in terms of preventing a different way of organizing the world's knowledge, which would not be dominated by advertising. All of these activities, however good and how many benefits they produce, also entail costs, right? And we have only scratched the surface in the past few years, thinking about fake news and how information circulates, in grasping what those costs are.
Before we go into that, I think that I wanted you to touch a very important topic that now people are more familiar than ever, more sensitive than ever, and it's data. You wrote a very interesting piece on socializing the data centers. Now we are like in a very dangerous position where big pharma wants the data that we are producing on our health and our the way we interact, and big tech is very keen as well on getting that data. Do you think that this will be the moment on that on pushing that idea of socializing at least the health data? And do you think that it will be the moment of for citizens to seize the opportunity, at least at the local level, to solve problems related to what is like the most important thing for them at the moment, which is survival and going back to work?
Yes, well, so on a very kind of specific, tangible level, I think, of course, you have to be making political claims about immense value residing in that data and companies essentially leveraging that data for their own good. I mean, to me, it's clear that we should not pretend that this is some kind of a gift that these companies take from nature. I mean, they don't take it from nature the way they take solar energy. You know, they grab it from us as a result of very specific extractive practices and hijacking our attention and making us click on, you know, like, after 300 anthropologists and designers have designed that button. So it's a very artificial and specific process. But I think beyond this very immediate and kind of practical level, we also have to understand that there is a danger here of realizing that once we have grabbed all the data for an alternative political project, the actual other parts of the stack that we need to have in place to make use of that data and to do something with it just do not exist, right? So in some sense, talking about nationalizing the data, or socializing the data centers, you know, which made for a very good slogan, which I have others have kind of played with and flirted with, it still downplays a little bit the degree of the struggles to come. Because unless we manage to actually build infrastructures of artificial intelligence and cloud computing and, you know, predictive analytics and machine learning that can actually process that data, compute it, use it to train themselves, and then do something with it, that data will be sort of useless, right? So to some extent, we have to be aware of that, and we don't want to set people's expectations so high that after we won that battle, we realize that there is actually not much that we can do with it. So as part of a more holistic project, and that's why, you know, in that follow-up article, I wrote a New Left review, which was a follow-up to that socialized data centers interview that I've given in 2015. My argument was to conceive of the struggle to come in much broader terms, and instead of, you know, data, talk about feedback infrastructure, right, which will allow us to have a more comprehensive approach. So we can think about sensors, we can think about servers, we can think about algorithms, we can think about data, we can think about this more holistically and plan our struggles more holistically. It's probably true that, you know, as we abstract, especially from purely tech issues and look at things like pharmaceuticals, data will probably play will have a disproportionate importance compared to other parts of the stack. But in many other areas and spheres of life, data will be less important than the sensors or, you know, screens or other ways to shape behavior of individuals. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yes, and here, like now going back to Syllabus and to what you're doing, what is very interesting, and also the algorithms that shape somehow our priorities and our personal perceptions of a situation unfolding. To me, it was very interesting, a donation that Google did, like a very generous Google donated $800 million. I read it in the syllabus in one of the top articles, and most of the money that they donated to place ads. And many of the collaborations between Silicon Valley and governments and international organizations is precisely that. It's precisely like a function that belonged in the past to public broadcasters and newspapers and so on, is now them placing the most relevant information at the top, but them as well, big tech companies as well, creating new, really challenging problems when addressing I mean, not necessarily new in nature, but new in scale of this information when having accurate information can make the difference between being alive or dead. So I wanted, if you could explain to our audience how the searching relevant information is becoming a problem. What you are doing at a very sophisticated level, but what should be done and what should be our political ask in the left to fix this problem, because we are also being affected by this hegemonic manipulation of information.
Yes. Well, I mean, look, first of all, I think as years go by, I become a little bit less obsessed with companies themselves and much more obsessed with kind of broader, deeper structures behind them. So, you know, when Google does what it does, by and large, they're behaving quite rationally as any set of rationally behaving capitalists would. So, you know, to blame them for following the imperatives of the system, occasionally I find counterproductive. So we need to kind of abstract from that and move to a higher level, and then to be trying to understand how those imperatives that they follow have come about. But beyond that, I think, look, we have especially with social media, so Google is just part of the problem. But you know, if you look at Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to some extent, but especially those three, and YouTube. So you look at those four companies, and of course we know that Alphabet owns YouTube just like it owns Google. If you look at them, there are very particular economics of knowledge discovery and knowledge distribution built into them. So, you know, if you look at YouTube, it's obvious that most of the high quality institutions around the globe, art galleries, think tanks, universities, libraries, make a lot of events, they host a lot of events, and they produce a lot of videos related to those events, and they upload them to YouTube, right? Which is normal. So we have a vast repository of information out there, and a lot of it is high quality information. It's very hard to make a profit from those footages, from that footage, at scale that YouTube and Google requires, as opposed to showing people something that's much funnier or something that's much more entertaining. Not because there are no people that would like to watch a talk from an art gallery or from a library, but just because there are relatively fewer of them, and it takes time to target them well, and it basically doesn't produce as much profit. So none of those videos traditionally make it into the most highly recommended and suggested videos by the YouTube algorithm. So most of those videos end up having 5, 50, 100 views, and they never get discovered, right? And it's not because they're not there, they are there, you can find them, but it's only because our public sphere, as tied as it is to online advertising as a driving imperative, creates no incentives for the discovery of such content. Right. So, and it's the same story with a lot of journalism, with a lot of podcasts, with a lot of academic articles, which, you know, have their own problems because they're controlled by these giant academic publishers that charge a lot of money for publishing research funded by taxpayers. So what I started doing for some time now, and, you know, we launched about a year ago, I founded this initiative called the Syllabus, which essentially tries to break the economics of how high quality information gets discovered and distributed online. So we go after 60 relatively highbrow and important topics, from human rights to neoliberalism to work, to artificial intelligence, to women's rights, to climate change. And we really try to systematically find the most relevant recent content, the most interesting recent content that should be packaged and distributed to our users and subscribers, right? And the idea here is that while we cannot compete with YouTube and Google because they have their own scale of milking us for cash or milking us for our data and then selling that data or trading on that data to sell advertising, we just think that we can actually show that a very different arrangement is possible, that you don't need to end up in a black hole of trivial content every time you start your browser. Right? That's not a natural consequence of, it's not gravity force of the digital economy. It's the gravity force of a digital economy tied to advertising as a central funding mechanism. Right? And we don't track, we don't do advertising, we don't do any personalization based on your behavior. Right? We can personalize the newsletter or the syllabus that we receive every week from us, which can contain 15, 20 links, but we personalize them based on the topics that you said you're interested in. Whether you then click on those links or don't, we don't track and we don't want to track. So it's quite a bold move. So I see it also as some kind of a performative enterprise, which can show, in fact, that if we manage to change access conditions to the underlying infrastructures, so to find those videos on YouTube, for example, I have to pay YouTube a fee because I have to use the API to constantly query and see what new videos have been uploaded to channels I'm interested in and so forth. And of course, in order to do that, you either need to have deep pockets, you need to be a startup, or you need to have a business model, which might perhaps be funded by advertising or data extraction. There is no other way, there is no library model, there is no university model, there is no tax-funded model for people who would like to build a different digital economy to get access to those resources and infrastructures. And it's a scandal. And I think that we have to understand that all the lies we've heard in the last decade, that we are living in the most innovative economy imaginable, they're just false. I mean, we accept the status quo pushed to us by corporations as the peak of innovation, while in fact it might actually be its bottom, right? And to get to the actual peak, we need to imagine what would change if everybody who wanted to build another Wikipedia had access to the resources that they need to actually build it, and not think about like a startup, well, I will need to go and turn to SoftBank and raise $3 billion so that I can grow, and I will then collect users' data, and then I'll raise another $1 billion. That's the mentality that we are right now cultivating, and we need to get off that track.
And for that we need politics, but unfortunately, I mean, it's a privatized platform where the politician is being those being elected. It is behaving a little bit like our political system is behaving a little bit like the algorithm of Google, getting us the most sensationalistic, really bad, but really attracting a lot of attention and distraction candidate as a result in most of the countries. And so to think about the future and to think about this wish list, this what you suggest of this new digital New Deal, we need to get in power. And to get in power, we need to somehow break this very complicated situation right now of the privatized platforms and the privatized politics. So if we, because we are in the last 10 minutes of the interview, if you could a plan of action with 3 bold actions that we can take, or priorities that we can take, or 3 as an arbitrary number, you can say as many as you want. And, yes. And what will be and dreaming once we are in power, which I hope that it will be soon, what will be these basic elements on the digital New Deal that you have been writing about, to frame it in positive?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've never written about the digital New Deal, so you can never say that I haven't. So
I read an interview.
I'm a bit uneasy, with framing it that way, because it sort of presupposes already the answer, right? And the answer is that we need massive investments into infrastructures. We need massive transformations that will involve the government, and they will kind of take power from the private holders of power and so forth, right? So it has a certain historical baggage and legacy, because we always think about the New Deal as such, as it happened. So, for me, before we even get to that stage, I would like the progressive project to have a set of core ideas for what it would like democracy and democratic public life to look like, right? And that, of course, set of ideas has to be based to some extent on the analysis of current power relations in Europe and in the world. So in that sense, DiEM has been trying to move in that direction, and there is no shortage of papers that position various member states and European institutions with regards to the European kind of bodies or body politic of European citizens, so to say, which elects them. So all of that is good and nice. But I think what I find missing, not in specific movements, but in the kind of camp of people on the left and the kind of progressive social forces, is this kind of raison d'etre so to say, right? Is what are they here to do? And of course, it's very easy to say that we are here to protect the weakest, we are here to make the world more egalitarian and more just. And this, of course, a timeless truth, and they will always define the left vis-a-vis the right. But what are we here to do in 2020, right? Which is not just about solving the problem of inequality or tackling climate change or ridding us of surveillance or restoring privacy, which is a reactionary program. It reacts upon problems that were caused by decades of neoliberalism. And in the absence of other talking points and other action plans, this is as good as it can get. But what I am contesting is the idea that this program of reaction, right, of this reactive program, that it suffices for the left to be the winner, right? And I think this is where we need a proactive program. And I would argue that this proactive program has, it will sound rather banal and almost like, the talking points of consultancy firms, but it has to involve the empowerment of the citizen vis-a-vis institutions, and it has to involve the empowerment of citizens vis-a-vis each other, right? And I would argue that that can only happen if we put digital technologies at the heart of the transformation, right? We can clearly understand now that people can relate to each other in ways that are different from those that were present when we all had to work in a factory, right? Or we all had to live in a crowded city. Now we live in a different social condition. Digital technologies allow us, and maybe this quarantine will prove that, they allow us to relate to each other in a very different way. And we have to re-examine our political life with the centrality of mediation by digital technologies, but not by digital platforms, right, at its center. If we start from the assumption that everything is digital and there is metadata about everything, privacy and everything else being respected, if we start from those assumptions, what kind of institutions of the welfare state and solidarity we would build? For me, the goal is not to invent 100 ways through which we can defend the public healthcare system or the public education system. I mean, this is a very important and noble paradigm. And I'm pretty sure that there are lots of social democratic and even communist forces on the left in Europe that are thinking hard about this issue. And, they have all my respect. But this cannot define the horizon of possibility of the progressive project, right? And it has also to invent new institutions of solidarity, new institutions of collaboration, new institutions of being together. And unless we manage to articulate what those are, I think it's not very useful to be putting together a list after list of policy proposals of how we are going to get there, because we don't know where it is we want to get.
Thank you. I need to ask you a couple of questions very quickly from the audience. There's two questions. And one is on the tactics of direct action, whether it might be useful, which tactics you suggest that will be useful in deterring more aggressive surveillance and authoritarianism? And because now in many countries it's being used as an excuse to restrict rights. Do you have any tips or any tactics that you want to share? And the second is, what do you think of the app in China based on scanning QR codes that allow people to track if they have been near someone infected with COVID? I know that you addressed a little bit, I needed to ask.
Yeah. So on the QR codes, again, for me, it's kind of part of this more punitive solutionist paradigm, right? Where we, instead of empowering people with knowledge, the way people who are big fan of nudging would do, right? That's another kind of paradigm of more progressive solutionist apps, which will tell you that, you have to change your behavior, you have to wash your hands because it's good for society. Whereas, more punitive solutionists will tell you you have to wash your hands, or otherwise your smart house will not unlock your doors, right? So clearly these two paradigms compete. And the Chinese QR codes example, I think, is the extreme enunciation of this punitive paradigm. And of course, we in Europe are still, to some extent, safe from such excesses because we still operate in a paradigm of rights. And it's still, despite all the problems we're having now with rising authoritarianism, is still strong enough to resist this pressure for efficient compliance. Right? And as long as we can continue defending that, I think we will resist the temptation. When it comes to questions about direct action, I mean, look, again, this 1 hour of interventions that I've done at a somewhat philosophical and abstract level should not be taken to mean that the work of activists or NGOs, cryptographers is not important. Right? It's clearly important and there should be more of it. And I welcome people who basically even bypass the kind of hustle and bustle of electoral politics and they try to change things directly through their organizations, through the activism, through their campaigns. All of that is fantastic. You know, to some extent, I'm doing that as well with the Syllabus project, right? It's not only that, you know, so I'm on board with people doing practical and pragmatic things. But I think it's also quite easy to get lost in this forest, right? And not to see it focusing on too many trees. And this is where, you know, I don't want to be doing this kind of comparative evaluations, whether work on cryptography is more important than the work on freedom of expression, or whether the work of, you know, hackers and activists is more important than the work of journalists who then use some of the tools developed by them. I think, you know, we are not, we should kind of avoid such normative evaluations, but I would still urge this community to which I belonged, and you know, I reflect and talk to practitioners quite often. I think we have to develop a more reflective attitude that would also be able to abstract from the here and now and develop a more historical reading of the situation. Because otherwise, I fear that it's either our work remains somewhat futile, or it actually plays directly into the hands of this solutionist beast that I have been characterizing throughout this hour.
Or even worse, you know, 1 year ago today, my friend and founding member of DiEM25, Julian Assange, was arrested, and he was one of the most vocal voices against this techno-imperialism being imposed on us. So I want to thank you for your time tonight.
Sure.
And I want to tell you as well that many of your ideas inspired the DiEM tech pillar. We developed some pillar of policies, which is evolving all the time and facing the new situations. And I think that the exchange that we had tonight will inspire our tech pillar further, and it will inspire a lot of people listening to you. And we are really looking forward your next articles and also the next selection by Syllabus on COVID, the politics of COVID. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure.
And yeah, all the best.